In the autumn of 1863, in the remote village of Steinwald, nestled deep within the Bavarian forest near the Czech border, a discovery would unearth secrets that had been buried for generations. The village, with its population of barely 200 souls, existed in virtual isolation, connected to the outside world only by a narrow dirt road that became impassable during the harsh winter months. It was here, among the towering spruce trees and mist-shrouded valleys, that researchers would stumble upon documents that would forever change our understanding of how folklore can mask the darkest of human truths. The story begins with Professor Heinrich Müller, a folklore specialist from the University of Munich, who arrived in Steinwald in September of 1863 to collect traditional tales from the elderly villagers. Professor Müller, a man of 52 years with greying temples and wire-rimmed spectacles, had spent the better part of his academic career documenting the oral traditions of Bavaria's most isolated communities. What he discovered in Steinwald, however, would prove to be far more than mere folklore. According to village records archived in the local church, Steinwald had been established in the early 17th century by a small group of families fleeing religious persecution. The community had remained largely unchanged for over 2 centuries, with the same family names appearing generation after generation in the baptismal and burial records. The villagers were known for their insularity, their suspicion of outsiders, and their adherence to traditions that predated organized Christianity. Professor Müller took lodgings at the home of Wilhelm Brenner, the village baker, whose family had lived in Steinwald for 8 generations. The Brenner house, a sturdy, half-timbered structure with thick stone foundations, sat at the edge of the village square, its windows offering a view of the dark forest that seemed to press against the settlement like a living wall. It was during his 3rd night in the village that Professor Müller first heard the story that would consume the remainder of his research. According to his journal, dated September 21st, 1863, Professor Müller was awakened shortly after midnight by what he described as a sound like weeping, carried on the wind from the direction of the forest. When he mentioned this to his host the following morning, Wilhelm Brenner's demeanor changed noticeably. The baker, a normally jovial man in his 40s, became withdrawn and suggested that certain sounds in Steinwald were best left uninvestigated. It was Brenner's elderly mother, Bertha, a woman of 78 years who had spent her entire life in the village, who first mentioned the name Rotkäppchen. The old woman, whose mind remained sharp despite her advanced age, spoke of events that had occurred during her childhood. In the early years of the 19th century, she told Professor Müller of a young woman named Margaret Zimmermann, who had disappeared in the winter of 1809, and whose story had become the foundation for a tale that would eventually reach the ears of Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. The Zimmermann family had been among the original settlers of Steinwald. Johann Zimmermann, Margaret's father, served as the village woodcutter, a position that required him to venture deep into the forest on a daily basis. His daughter Margaret, described in church records as a girl of 18 years with distinctive auburn hair, had been known throughout the village for her unusual practice of wearing a red woolen cloak that had belonged to her deceased grandmother. The cloak, according to testimonies collected by Professor Müller, was of such a vivid crimson that it could be spotted from considerable distances, even among the dense undergrowth of the forest. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Margaret had taken to making regular visits to a cottage that stood approximately 3 miles from the village centre, deep within the forest along a path that was barely more than a deer track. The cottage belonged to her maternal grandmother, Magdalena Weber, a woman of advanced age who lived alone and was rumoured to possess knowledge of herbal remedies and folk medicine. Village records indicate that Magdalena Weber was viewed with a mixture of respect and suspicion by her neighbours. as was common for elderly women who lived in isolation and practiced traditional healing arts. According to testimony given to Professor Müller by several elderly villagers, Margaret's visits to her grandmother's cottage had become increasingly frequent during the autumn of 1809. The young woman would set out early in the morning, carrying a basket of food and supplies, and would typically return before nightfall. However, on the morning of November 15th, 1809, Margarete departed for her grandmother's cottage and never returned. When Johann Zimmermann and several other village men ventured into the forest the following day to search for his daughter, they made a discovery that would haunt Steinwald for generations to come. The grandmother's cottage, which had stood for over 40 years, was found completely empty. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of violence, and no indication of where either Margaret or her grandmother might have gone. The cottage appeared to have been abandoned in haste, with food still sitting on the table and the fire in the hearth reduced to cold ashes. What disturbed the search party most profoundly was the discovery of Margaret's red cloak, found hanging from a tree branch approximately 100 yards from the cottage. The cloak was intact, showing no signs of damage or violence, but it had been arranged in a manner that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. Beneath the tree where the cloak was found, the searchers discovered what appeared to be the remains of a large fire, surrounded by stones arranged in a specific pattern that none of the villagers recognized. In his journal entry dated September 25, 1863, Professor Müller noted that the villagers' accounts of the events following Margaret's disappearance were remarkably consistent, despite being passed down through oral tradition for over 50 years. According to these accounts, the cottage where Magdalena Weber had lived remained empty for several months after the disappearance. However, in the spring of 1810, villagers began reporting that smoke could occasionally be seen rising from the cottage's chimney, and that lights were sometimes visible through its windows during the darkest hours of the night. These reports led to a second search of the cottage, conducted in May of 1810 by a group that included Johann Zimmermann, the village priest Father Andreas Keller, and 6 other men. What they discovered inside the cottage defied explanation, and would become the source of whispered rumors that persisted for decades. According to the testimony of Father Keller, recorded in the church archives, the cottage contained evidence that someone had been living there, but not in any manner that could be considered normal or civilized. The interior of the cottage had been transformed into what Father Keller described as a den of such profound wrongness that the very air seemed corrupted. The furniture had been rearranged to create what appeared to be a shrine or altar, surrounded by objects that the priest refused to describe in detail in his official report. More disturbing still was the discovery of numerous bones, later determined by the village doctor to be of animal origin, arranged in patterns that suggested some form of ritualistic practice. Among the most unsettling discoveries was a collection of clothing that included several items belonging to Margaret Zimmermann, as well as garments that were later identified as having belonged to other young women from neighboring villages who had disappeared over the preceding years. The clothing had been carefully preserved and arranged in a manner that suggested they held special significance for whoever had been inhabiting the cottage. Father Keller's report, written in Latin and archived in the church records, included references to evidence of practices that no Christian soul should witness, and signs of communion with forces that exist beyond the realm of God's creation. The priest recommended that the cottage be destroyed immediately, and that the ground be consecrated to prevent whatever evil had taken root there from spreading further. However, before the cottage could be destroyed, Johann Zimmermann made a discovery that would provide the final horrifying piece to the puzzle of his daughter's disappearance. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cottage's main room, he found a leather-bound journal written in his daughter's distinctive handwriting. The journal, which Professor Müller was permitted to examine during his stay in Steinwald, contained entries dating from the autumn of 1809 through the early months of 1810. The journal revealed that Margaret had not been visiting her grandmother out of filial duty, as the village had assumed. According to her own written account, Margaret had been drawn to the cottage by her grandmother's promises of knowledge and power that could not be obtained through conventional means. Magdalena Weber, it appeared, had been teaching her granddaughter practices that were far removed from simple herbal medicine, practices that involved the deliberate cultivation of darkness and the abandonment of human compassion. The journal entries described a gradual transformation in Margaret's world-view and personality. Early entries expressed excitement about learning her grandmother's secrets, while later entries revealed a growing detachment from human emotion and an increasing fascination with what she described as the true nature of hunger. The final entries, written in an increasingly erratic hand, suggested that Margaret had come to view other human beings not as fellow creatures deserving of compassion, but as sources of sustenance for something that lived within the depths of the forest. According to Professor Müller's notes, the most disturbing aspect of Margaret's journal was not the content itself, but the gradual change in her handwriting and language use as the entries progressed. The early entries were written in the clear, educated script of a young woman from a respectable family. However, as the months passed, the handwriting became increasingly primitive and savage, with several entries written in what appeared to be a mixture of blood and ink. The final entry, dated March 19, 1810, consisted of only a single sentence. "I understand now what grandmother meant when she said that some hungers can never be satisfied." The journal's final pages contained detailed descriptions of the cottage's other visitors, young women from neighboring villages who had come seeking Magdalena Weber's assistance with various ailments and troubles. According to Margaret's increasingly disturbed accounts, these visitors had not received the help they sought. Instead, they had become part of what she described as grandmother's collection, their possessions and clothing carefully preserved as mementos of encounters that no civilized mind could comprehend. When Johann Zimmermann brought his daughter's journal to Father Keller, the priest immediately declared it to be evidence of the most profound evil and ordered that it be destroyed. However, unknown to the priest, Johann had already made a copy of the journal's contents, which he secreted away in his own home. This copy would eventually find its way to Professor Müller over 50 years later, providing the foundation for his understanding of the true events that had inspired the tale of Little Red Riding Hood. The cottage was burned to the ground in June of 1810, with Father Keller performing an elaborate consecration ritual before, during, and after the destruction. The site was then marked with a stone cross and declared to be permanently off-limits to all villagers. However, according to testimony collected by Professor Müller, the destruction of the cottage did not end the strange occurrences in the forest surrounding Steinwald. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1810, villagers reported encounters with a figure dressed in a red cloak who could be seen moving through the forest during the darkest hours of the night. These sightings were always brief and occurred at the very edge of perception, leaving witnesses uncertain whether they had actually seen anything at all. Some described the figure as clearly human, while others insisted that its movements were wrong in some fundamental way, too fluid and predatory to belong to any natural creature. The red-cloaked figure became a source of intense fear and speculation among the villagers, with parents forbidding their children from venturing into the forest alone and men traveling in groups when business required them to enter the woods. Several attempts were made to track the figure, but these expeditions invariably ended in failure, with the searchers returning to report that they had found only animal tracks and the occasional glimpse of red fabric disappearing into the undergrowth. In December of 1810, nearly a year after Margaret's initial disappearance, the village of Steinwald received an unexpected visitor, a man identifying himself as Wilhelm Grimm, a collector of folk tales from Kassel, arrived seeking stories and legends that he might record for posterity. According to church records, Grimm spent 3 days in Steinwald, during which time he spoke with numerous villagers about their local traditions and folklore. What Wilhelm Grimm recorded during his visit to Steinwald bore little resemblance to the true events that had terrorized the village for the preceding year. In his version of the tale, a young girl in a red cloak ventures into the forest to visit her grandmother, only to encounter a wolf who devours the old woman and takes her place. The story, as Grimm recorded it, concluded with the girl and her grandmother being rescued by a helpful woodsman who kills the wolf and restores order to the forest. Professor Müller's investigation revealed that this sanitized version of events had been deliberately crafted by Father Keller and the village elders, who recognized the danger of allowing the true story to spread beyond Steinwald's borders. The priest had instructed the villagers to present Grimm with a version of events that contained enough truth to be believable while obscuring the darker elements that might attract unwanted attention from outsiders who might seek to investigate or exploit the village's secrets. The wisdom of Father Keller's decision became apparent in the years following Wilhelm Grimm's visit. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood, as recorded in the Grimm brothers' collection, became widely known throughout Germany and eventually spread across Europe and beyond. However, the sanitized version of the story served as a kind of protective camouflage for Steinwald, allowing the village to maintain its isolation while satisfying outside curiosity about its folklore. According to the testimony of villagers interviewed by Professor Müller, the sightings of the red-cloaked figure continued sporadically throughout the 1810s and 1820s. These encounters gradually became less frequent, but they never ceased entirely. Children were warned never to venture into the forest alone, and even adult men avoided certain paths and clearings that were associated with the most disturbing sightings. In 1837, nearly 30 years after Margaret Zimmermann's disappearance, Steinwald experienced a series of events that convinced many villagers that their nightmare was far from over. A young woman named Elizabeth Huber, aged 22, who had recently married into the village, disappeared while gathering firewood in the forest. Like Margaret before her, Elizabeth was known for wearing a distinctive red shawl that had been a wedding gift from her new mother-in-law. Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Huber, organized a search party that discovered her red shawl hanging from the same tree where Margaret's cloak had been found nearly 3 decades earlier. This time, however, the searchers found additional evidence that suggested Elizabeth's fate had been quite different from Margaret's. Scattered around the base of the tree were fragments of bone and cloth that appeared to be the remains of a violent struggle. More disturbing still was the discovery of what appeared to be a crude shelter constructed in the ruins of Magdalena Weber's cottage. Someone had rebuilt a portion of the structure using stones from the original foundation and branches from the surrounding trees. Inside this makeshift dwelling, the searchers found evidence that suggested it had been occupied recently, including the remnants of fires and fragments of various personal belongings that could not be identified. The discovery of the rebuilt cottage prompted Father Keller, now an elderly man of 73, to organize a second consecration of the site. This time, the ritual included the complete removal of the cottage's stone foundation and the scattering of blessed salt over the entire area. The priest also arranged for a permanent watch to be established, with village men taking turns to patrol the forest and ensure that nothing could be rebuilt at the cursed location. However, these precautions proved insufficient to prevent the tragedy that befell Steinwald in the winter of 1841. During a particularly severe blizzard that lasted for 5 days, the village lost contact with the outside world completely. When the storm finally subsided, the villagers discovered that 3 young women had vanished without explanation. Unlike the previous disappearances, these women had not ventured into the forest. They had simply disappeared from their homes during the night, leaving behind no trace of their passage. The missing women were Anna Weber, age 19, the great-niece of the deceased Magdalena Weber; Greta Brenner, age 21, daughter of the village baker; and Maria Huber, age 18, younger sister of the previously disappeared Elizabeth. Each of the missing women had owned a red garment of some kind, leading the villagers to conclude that they had been specifically targeted because of this connection to the original tale. A massive search effort was organized, involving every able-bodied man in the village and several volunteers from neighboring communities. The searchers combed through every inch of the forest for miles around Steinwald, but they found no trace of the missing women. What they did discover, however, was evidence that someone or something had been living in the forest for an extended period, constructing a series of well-concealed shelters and supply caches throughout the area. These discoveries included crude huts built into hillsides and hidden beneath fallen trees, as well as stores of preserved food and what appeared to be trophies taken from various victims over the years. Among these trophies were items of clothing, jewelry, and personal belongings that were eventually identified as having belonged to young women who had disappeared from villages throughout the region over the preceding decades. The magnitude of these discoveries forced the villagers to confront a horrifying possibility: that Margaret Zimmermann's transformation in her grandmother's cottage had been only the beginning of a cycle of predation that had continued unabated for over 30 years. The red-cloaked figure that had haunted the forest was not a ghost or supernatural entity, but something far more terrifying. A human being who had deliberately abandoned all traces of humanity and embraced the existence based on hunger and predation. Professor Miller's investigation of these events, conducted with the assistance of Johann Zimmermann's eldest son, Heinrich, revealed additional evidence that supported this conclusion. Among the papers preserved in the Zimmermann family archives was a series of letters written by Johann in the years following his daughter's disappearance. These letters, addressed to his deceased wife, described his growing conviction that Margareta had not died in the forest, but had instead become something that could no longer be considered human. According to these private letters, Johann had continued to search the forest for signs of his daughter long after the official search efforts had been abandoned. During these solitary expeditions, he had discovered evidence that convinced him that Margaret was still alive, still living somewhere in the depths of the woods, and still following the path of darkness that her grandmother had set her upon. The letters described encounters with a figure that Johann believed to be his transformed daughter, encounters that left him convinced that whatever Margaret had become, it retained enough of its original identity to recognize him while being completely beyond redemption or salvation. The letters also revealed Johann's growing obsession with understanding what had happened to his daughter and his desperate attempts to find some way to either save her or stop her from claiming additional victims. He had consulted with priests from neighboring parishes, traveled to distant monasteries seeking guidance from learned theologians, and even attempted to locate other practitioners of the dark arts who might possess knowledge of how to reverse Margaret's transformation. These efforts had proven fruitless, leading Johann to a state of despair that was evident in his final letters. He wrote of his certainty that his daughter would continue to claim victims as long as she remained in the forest, and of his growing conviction that he bore responsibility for her actions because of his failure to recognize the danger posed by his former mother-in-law's influence. The final letter in the collection, dated March of 1829, expressed Johann's intention to enter the forest alone and not return until he had either saved his daughter or ensured that she could claim no more victims. Johann Zimmermann was found dead in the forest 3 days after writing his final letter. His body was discovered in a clearing approximately 2 miles from the site of his former mother-in-law's cottage, arranged in a manner that suggested he had been waiting for someone or something when death overtook him. The cause of death was officially attributed to exposure, but several details surrounding the discovery troubled those who found him. Johann's body was completely undisturbed by scavengers, despite having lain in the forest for several days during a period when wolves and other predators were known to be active in the area. More puzzling still was the discovery that his clothing had been carefully arranged and his personal belongings placed around him in a pattern that resembled the ritualistic arrangements that had been found in Magdalena Weber's cottage years earlier. These details suggested that Johann had not died alone, and that whoever had been with him during his final moments had possessed both the knowledge and the inclination to arrange his body according to some arcane significance. The years following Johann's death saw a gradual decline in the reported sightings of the red-cloaked figure, leading some villagers to hope that whatever evil had plagued Steinwald had finally been laid to rest. However, this hope proved to be premature. In 1855, 16 years after the mass disappearance during the blizzard, Steinwald experienced its final recorded encounter with the entity that had haunted it for nearly half a century. A merchant traveling through the region reported seeing a woman in a tattered red cloak standing beside the path that led to the village. According to his account, the woman appeared to be elderly, with long white hair and clothing that seemed to have been patched and repatched numerous times over many years. When he attempted to approach her to offer assistance, the woman retreated into the forest with movements that the merchant described as unnaturally swift and fluid. The merchant's description was particularly unsettling because it suggested that whatever Margaret Zimmermann had become, it had continued to age and deteriorate over the decades while maintaining its predatory nature. The image of an elderly woman in a red cloak, moving through the forest with inhuman grace and purpose, represented the final degradation of what had once been a young woman from a respectable family. This sighting proved to be the last confirmed encounter with the red-cloaked figure. Professor Müller's investigation in 1863 found no evidence of any disappearances or unusual events in the region for the 8 years preceding his arrival. The villagers expressed cautious optimism that their long nightmare had finally ended, while acknowledging that the forest around Steinwald would forever be marked by the evil that had dwelt within it for so many years. Professor Müller's research in Steinwald concluded in October of 1863, after 6 weeks of intensive investigation. His findings, recorded in a detailed report that was filed with the University of Munich, provided a comprehensive account of how a simple folk tale had been used to disguise one of the most disturbing cases of human transformation and predation in recorded history. However, Professor Müller's report was never published, and the documents he collected during his investigation were quietly archived in the university's restricted collection. According to university records examined years later, Professor Müller had intended to publish his findings as part of a comprehensive study of how folklore could be used to conceal actual criminal activity. However, his superiors at the university determined that the material was too disturbing for public consumption and might encourage similar acts if widely disseminated. The decision to suppress Professor Müller's research was made in consultation with both religious and civil authorities. who agreed that the public interest would be better served by allowing the sanitized version of the tale to remain in circulation. The original documents collected by Professor Müller remained in the university archives until they were transferred to a government facility in 1937, as part of a broader effort to centralize historical records. These documents were classified as restricted access and were subsequently lost during the chaos of the war years. Official records indicate that the entire collection was destroyed during an Allied bombing raid in 1943, ensuring that the true story of Little Red Riding Hood would remain buried forever. However, a single copy of Professor Müller's report survived the destruction, having been secretly made by a university librarian who recognized the historical significance of the research. This copy was discovered in 1967 among the papers of Dr. Friedrich Steinberg, a retired professor of anthropology who had maintained a private collection of documents relating to German folklore. Dr. Steinberg's executors found the report while sorting through his papers after his death, and they briefly considered publishing it as part of a scholarly journal. The decision to once again suppress the material was made after consultation with surviving members of the Steinwald community, who expressed their desire to let the past remain buried. The village itself had been largely abandoned during the war years, with most of its inhabitants relocated to larger towns and cities. The few remaining residents were elderly individuals who remembered the old stories and who believed that some secrets were better left undisturbed. Today, the site of Steinwald exists only as a collection of overgrown foundations, hidden beneath decades of forest growth. The narrow road that once connected the village to the outside world has been reclaimed by nature, and most maps no longer show any indication that a settlement ever existed in that remote corner of the Bavarian forest. The transformation of the village from a living community to a forgotten ruin mirrors the transformation of its most famous tale from a documented case of human evil to a beloved children's story. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood continues to be told to children around the world, serving as a simple moral lesson about the dangers of straying from the path and talking to strangers. Few who hear the story realize that its origins lie not in the realm of fantasy, but in the documented testimony of witnesses who saw human nature stripped of all pretense of civilization and revealed in its most predatory form. The forest where these events unfolded remains largely uninhabited, avoided by locals who remember the old warnings, and respected by outsiders who sense something unsettling about its perpetual twilight. Occasionally, hikers report finding the remnants of old stone foundations or catching glimpses of red fabric among the trees. But these reports are generally dismissed as products of imagination or misidentification of natural phenomena. Perhaps it is fitting that the true story of Little Red Riding Hood has been allowed to fade into obscurity, leaving only the sanitized version to survive in popular memory. There are some truths that serve no useful purpose once revealed, some knowledge that brings only darkness to those who possess it. The villagers of Steinwald understood this principle, and their decision to transform their nightmare into a harmless fairy tale may have been the wisest choice they could have made. In the end, the greatest horror of the Little Red Riding Hood case may not be the documented evidence of human transformation and predation, but the recognition that such evil can arise in the most ordinary circumstances, among the most respectable families, and in the most isolated communities. The story serves as a reminder that civilization is a fragile construct, always threatened by the possibility that some individuals will choose to abandon their humanity in pursuit of hungers that can never be satisfied. The path through the forest remains, overgrown and forgotten, leading to clearings where cottages once stood and where families once lived in peace. Nature has reclaimed what humanity built, and time has obscured what memory once preserved. But somewhere, beneath the accumulated layers of leaves and soil, the foundations remain, marking the spots where ordinary people once made choices that transformed them into something beyond human understanding. And in the silence of the forest, where even the wind seems reluctant to disturb the stillness, there are those who claim they can still hear the echo of footsteps on the path, moving with purpose through the trees, always following the route that leads from innocence to predation, from humanity to hunger, from the safety of home to the darkness that waits at the end of every trail. The records show that Professor Müller departed Steinwald on October 31st, 1863, carrying with him a burden of knowledge that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. His personal correspondence, discovered after his death in 1891, revealed a man consumed by the implications of what he had uncovered in that remote Bavarian village. In letter after letter to his colleagues and family members, Professor Müller struggled to reconcile his academic understanding of folklore with the documented evidence of genuine evil that he had encountered. He wrote of sleepless nights spent wondering how many other seemingly innocent tales might conceal similar horrors, and of his growing conviction that humanity possessed depths of darkness that scholarship could never adequately explain or contain. The professor's final years were marked by increasing isolation and what his contemporaries described as an obsessive fascination with the relationship between folklore and criminal behavior. He abandoned his teaching responsibilities at the University of Munich and devoted himself entirely to private research, traveling throughout Germany in search of other communities that might harbor secrets similar to those he had discovered in Steinwald. Professor Müller's death in 1891 was officially attributed to a heart condition, but his housekeeper reported that his final words were a warning about the paths that lead into the forest and the hunger that wears a human face. His research notes, found scattered throughout his study, contained references to dozens of folk tales from across Europe, each annotated with questions about what real events might have inspired their creation. The University of Munich quietly disposed of Professor Müller's private papers, determining that his later research had descended into the realm of unhealthy obsession and posed no academic value. However, his original report on Steinwald remained in the restricted archives, a testament to one man's encounter with a truth too disturbing for civilized society to acknowledge. In the decades that followed, the few remaining traces of Steinwald's dark history gradually faded from human memory. The last survivor who had lived through the events of the early 19th century died in 1897. Taking with her the final first-hand testimony of what had transpired in those shadowed woods. The village itself was officially removed from government records in 1903, its existence reduced to a footnote in regional historical surveys. Today, more than a century and a half after the events that inspired the tale of Little Red Riding Hood, the forest where Margaret Zimmermann chose darkness over humanity remains largely unchanged. The trees have grown taller, the undergrowth has become denser, and the paths have been reclaimed by nature, but the silence that settles over those woods at dusk carries with it an echo of something that was never quite human and was never quite laid to rest. Occasionally, local authorities receive reports from hikers who claim to have seen a figure in red moving through the distant trees, always just beyond clear observation, always retreating when approached. These reports are filed and forgotten, dismissed as products of imagination influenced by too many retellings of a famous fairy tale. But perhaps in the deepest parts of the forest, where the sunlight never quite manages to penetrate the canopy, and where even the most experienced woodsmen hesitate to venture, something still follows the paths that Margaret Zimmermann first walked more than 2 centuries ago. Perhaps the hunger that consumed one young woman in 1809 was not the kind that could be satisfied by the passage of time or the intervention of death. The tale of Little Red Riding Hood continues to be told to children across the world, serving its purpose as a simple moral lesson about the dangers that await those who stray from the path of virtue and safety. The brothers Grimm could never have imagined that their sanitized version of a Bavarian folk tale would become one of the most enduring stories in human culture, spreading far beyond its origins to become a shared touchstone of childhood experience. In the end, perhaps this transformation represents the ultimate triumph of human resilience over human evil. By reducing the documented horrors of Steinwald to the manageable dimensions of a fairy tale, civilization found a way to preserve the essential warning while discarding the unbearable truth. Children learn to beware of wolves in the forest without having to confront the reality that sometimes the greatest dangers wear human faces and speak with human voices. The path through the forest remains, overgrown and forgotten, but it leads now only to empty clearings and crumbling foundations. The cottage where Magdalena Weber taught her granddaughter to embrace darkness exists only as scattered stones hidden beneath decades of accumulated leaves. The clearing where red cloaks were found hanging from tree branches has been reclaimed by nature, its significance known only to the silence that watches from between the trees. And somewhere, in the space between memory and forgetting, between the sanitized fairy tale and the documented truth, the real story of Little Red Riding Hood continues to whisper its warning to those who have ears to hear it. That the path into the forest leads not to grandmother's house, but to places where humanity loses its way and never finds its way back. The woods are dark and deep, and they have kept their secrets for more than 2 centuries. Perhaps it is better that way. Perhaps some truths are too dangerous to survive in the light of day, too corrosive to coexist with the innocence that allows children to sleep peacefully in their beds. Perhaps the greatest service that folklore can perform is not to preserve the truth, but to transform it into something that can be safely told and safely forgotten. In Steinwald, where it all began, the forest has reclaimed what was once human habitation, and the silence that falls between the trees each evening sounds very much like peace. But those who listen carefully, those who understand the true history of that place, know that some silences are louder than screams, and that some peace is purchased with prices too terrible to acknowledge. The tale lives on, sanitized and safe, while the truth lies buried beneath the accumulated leaves of centuries. And perhaps, when the wind moves through the trees in that forgotten corner of Bavaria, it carries with it the echo of footsteps on an ancient path, following a route that leads from innocence to hunger, from humanity to something else entirely, reminding us that some appetites once awakened are never truly satisfied.